Are we live? Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending where in the world you are. This is Reaction to Response, a webinar series put on through the Charter for Compassion's Women and Girls sector. I'm Lisa Berkeley, and this series provides us with an opportunity to hear from thought leaders who are helping us shift from fear-based reactions to care and compassionate-based responses. And as I just mentioned, we're put on through the Women and Girls sector of the Charter for Compassion International's community. And we are a network of networks that span over 400 cities or cities of compassion or communities of compassion with 1,800 partners in 53 countries, and we're divided into 12 sectors. You can learn more about us at thecharterforcompassion.org. Before we begin today's call, we're going to do a little bit of housekeeping. First, this call is being recorded, and if you have any tech issues, you can go to zoom.us. Also, for the first part of our call, we're going to be just our guest speaker, Armenta Hinton, and myself. And then at the end, we're going to bring everybody in for a shared conversation in the last half hour of this hour and a half call. But in the meantime, if any questions come up for you, you can hover at the bottom of your screen and you'll see a place for question and answers, or in the chat box. You can also pose question and answers. We have a fabulous team working behind the scenes to help us with all of that. And so I just want to give a shout out to and thank you to Sandy Hart, Brianna Lethorpe, Susan DeGaia, and Betsy Spano. Today's guest is Armenta Hinton. And Dr. Hinton is the Equity and Title IX Coordinator at Elizabethtown College. She's an active scholar practitioner and presenter in the area of Title IX, equity and diversity and inclusion, with a broad range of experience that includes 15 years in Germany and England. You can learn more about her on the Reaction to Response Charter for Compassion webpage. Before I officially welcome Armenta here, I would like to just say a couple of things about today's call. This conversation likely will touch buttons and perhaps make you uncomfortable. That is a little bit of what the purpose of this is, to help us wake up and become more conscientious of the world that we're living in order to create a more compassionate and care-based environment. So with that, I would very much like to say, welcome Armenta and good morning.
Thank you. Welcome to everyone that's joined the call.
Yeah. So before we get into our conversation, I would just like to, if we can go a little bit into your background so that people know what the meaning of your title is as far as Equity and Title IX Coordinator.
Right. So most people know that in the United States, colleges and universities are compelled to have a person like me at their institution. Sometimes we're a welcome entity, sometimes we are not. To be sure, where I have landed after you and I were in our PhD coursework together has been in liberal arts settings where colleges have these roles. They're called Equity, Title IX, sometimes Chief Diversity Officers, various and sundry titles, but they all do the same thing. And what that thing is to promote a diverse and interconnected environment for our growing diverse population. It is to make sure that we adhere to the federal guidelines of Title IX, which clearly stated is that no person on the basis of sex or gender shall be discriminated against. Now, that's a very small statement, but it encapsulates so much. And so my role is then more about providing equal access, eliminating discrimination, creating equitable salary ranges from even work study students to our president and things of that nature. So it's a very broad role, but it's a role that is very necessary in today's society.
So I'm going to put a pause here for the sake of transparency. As you just mentioned, I've had the profound honor of knowing Armenta, gosh, I think it's 7 years now.
I know, right?
since we
I
started
know.
our PhD journey. And she was one of the people, so yeah, I feel like I should give also a little bit more background about how this month's series came into being. So I was aware, and we're going to have this conversation on the 29th also, that within the intersectionality of spiritual coaching, and people trying to build a world based on care and compassion, that there has recently been a very powerful conversation, that conversation is actually rooted in a degree of white privilege for many people. Again, not for everyone. Like I said, we're going to be hitting on some terms that are going to be a little bit charged in this conversation.
Yes.
Um, uh, so and then I watched some exquisite women of color really get kind of trampled on. And when they were trying to say, well, I don't want to get into all of their conversation, but they were talking about how their experience of not having an equal playing field was, and not being, their voices were not heard. And so because Armenta and I have a very transparent conversation, and I'll say I have the honor to dance with her about education, and she'll be very blunt with me about, like, Lisa, you're being a little, you need to open your eyes a little bit better. I reached out to her among a number of women of color and said, is your voice getting repressed? Is this just this one community, or what's happening here? And so Armenta was the first person that we had a very powerful conversation on. And so I just wanted to lay that sort of out for the sake of transparency for this month's conversations, because I'd rather be open and honest about it. So I do have a question for you, though. You just said that you said some organizations will hire people like me.
That was charged, right?
That was charged. And so tell me, let's talk about that. What does that mean?
So it means many things. What I meant on a very high level is that they will hire a person to do this sometimes very toxic work of diversifying an institution and bringing to the fore those moments of inequity and discrimination, because that is essentially my role, right? And not just bringing it to the attention, but also presenting a remedy to any inequitable situations.
Okay.
Not every college or any institution that receives federal money, not everyone believes they need a person in that role. So that's the first piece of what I meant. The other part is to be in a senior position at a liberal arts institution, a small private liberal arts institution in the United States. People don't generally look like me in those positions, right? I'm a Black affirmed a woman. Make no apologies for that, but sometimes it causes some dissonance in certain rooms. So that's kind of what I meant by that.
And so, while the topic of, and I'm just setting the ground rules, so we're using the correct language, and also so that we can give other people the opportunity to explore the use of language in this conversation. So, is it appropriate to say women of color? Is it appropriate to say Black? But if it's not a Black woman, because it's not just Black women, and
I know this is very challenging for you. It always has been, and I have to say, it's so endearing. It's very endearing. I think in our very first session, you were touched by, and let me apologize to our listeners and people who've joined in, because it's kind of like a couple of old friends just, unfortunately, opening some old wounds of society. But in my first opportunity to meet you, we were sharing some things, and I believe you were challenged by, and just overwhelmed by a colleague in our cohort sharing that they couldn't get a Band-Aid, their skin tone.
Right.
And that has stayed with you.
Yep. That's right.
And I believe, if I may, I believe it has motivated the how and the what you do with your work, which is a good thing. I just want to say that. That moment of authenticity is not something that you get all of the time. And I don't mean to take over, but I just wanted to share with you. I was just having a conversation with a colleague about the word you use, privilege, this morning. And it's funny, some people can weaponize that word. Yeah, which you never do. So it's okay to be emotional about it. I think lean into it. It's hard. It's hard stuff.
Well, what got me emotional was like let me rewind, and to your point about what color is the Band-Aid, right? That's such a simple little thing that for a white person, it's Band-Aid. It's just okay. It doesn't match my skin color, but it's an effort.
Like, yes, it is.
You know, and when I watched sitting in this room, there was maybe 6 other black. Oh, so wait, let me put a pause here before we get into this. What I was trying to get at before I got emotional was, what's the right term? Because some women and some black people are very, very light. They almost look like they're white, and some are exquisite, dark indigo, beautiful, and then everything in the middle, all of it is beautiful. And so the emotion was, God, I can't curse on these things. Darn it. Like, why are we doing this? Because it's so harmful. Just because of a person's degree of melatonin in their skin, we're harming people, including on the subject of Band-Aids. And when, to me, back to the Band-Aid conversation, like I said, close to my skin color. And when I looked around the room, and I think I saw 6 degrees of black skin color looking at me and being like, do you get it now? And I don't want to say I was dismissive, but I was like, oh, come on, it's a Band-Aid. Partially. Not my heart was like, oh, it was a wake-up moment.
Yes.
But I actually, let me rephrase that. For me, it was a wake-up moment, but when I've talked to other people about it, this is a Band-Aid, come on. But whose skin? And so I don't mean to keep going back over that, but yeah. And also, I think for me, that what was symbolic too, is I have all these years of being a healer and trying to make the world better. And the symbolism of a Band-Aid, trying to, we put that on wounds, and like, oh, what color are we doing this to? Right. So anyway, I don't want to, it's a powerful question, and it's a little thing, but once you start to go down that rabbit hole, it changes how you look at the world. And I think too, the next part of a conversation that evolved from there was, but we're colorblind, and we were in another conversation about race, and I said, yeah, right. but why do we have to have this conversation even? We just have to have people become better, kinder people, and then we will be, like, never mind. It was never like, never mind the race issue, but why are we getting stuck here? Let's just be inclusive in our language, and everybody's here, and I'm colorblind, so it doesn't matter. I just see a person.
Right.
And that was the next schooling wake-up call.
Right. Well, but to answer your question, I think it's even more than just, I think now the politically correct way is, and depending on where you are, a lot of people lean into people of color, women of color. Mm-hmm. And that would include anyone that's not white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. So it could be any woman of difference, right? There's something I learned through my research, and that is that there are those social justice advocates such as Barbara Love And for any of your readers, listeners, Barbara Love was the creator of social justice education at the University of Massachusetts. And UMass Amherst to be specific. And I had the privilege of being in her company twice. And she shared, once was a lecture, once was for dinner. And she calls it people of color and difference, people of the global majority. Right?
That's so true, right?
It is so true. So in my writing these days, I've incorporated that concept that it's not just of color, it's most of the world, right? They're the people of the global majority that are of darker skin tone. And therefore, the kind of binary way that we look at it in the United States of you're either white or you're other, I tend not to do that as much.
So where I was actually starting to ask questions about was, so what term are you comfortable with? Although you just said it, but I just think of, oh, you're my friend Armenta, right? But when you said in the beginning of this conversation, people like me, that's going to be now another term that is in my, like, oh my God, it's like a Band-Aid kind of conversation. Because, so what do you like? What fits you? Should we say a Black woman? Should we say a woman of color? How, as a white person that is working to elevate this conversation and to really create it, that it's all colors and all colors are exquisite because that reflects the global majority. How do I navigate this?
I don't know. I think it really depends on setting. So if you are in academic environment, they seem to be very comfortable with students of color, faculty of color, women of color, people of color. It's better than what we've been called. So I'm okay with that, right? We are, however, still, if we are in academic settings, faced with the terror of racism and never knowing where it's going to come from, right? It can come from your classroom. I had an experience, it wasn't mine, but it was one that I had to address, where a woman of color in a classroom received a paper back from a student that had NB on it. So the word N and the word B on a paper with her name attached to it. And so, of course, you're grading your papers and you think, are you kidding? Did you really mean to do that?
Wait, what does that mean?
I don't think I can say it. Well, you know, the B word, right?
Bitch?
Yeah. And the N word, we won't say that word.
Right.
Right. So they wrote that Jane Doe, the professor's name, is a NB. And so she was reading this paper and she called me immediately, and I wasn't in my office. She called my cell. I didn't know what to do. I have to be honest. So when I say that we are faced with these moments of terror, doesn't matter what you call us.
So a student wrote that on a paper?
I'm sorry?
A student wrote that on the paper?
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
Because she was a woman of color, a Black professor, demanded certain standards. He wasn't very happy, I guess, and decided to take it out on her. I'll tell you why I remember it. It was just a few years ago, actually, and it was right before the Christmas holiday, the holiday break, right? And I just remembered what a horrible holiday she would be having, because how hostile and hateful and violent that is to read a student's paper and see that on it. Anyway, my point is, it doesn't matter so much what you call us as much as it does these moments of terror that we expect. I've come to expect it. Maybe not as frequently as in the 20s when they were lynching people, but clearly it still exists. There's still instances of professors having nooses hung on their door. There's still instances of, just 2 years ago, to be sure, there was an incident at a very top, I think it's one of the top 30 liberal arts institutions, not far from where I am. And they were on the radio station and said that you should hang all the ends. And of course, these students were expelled once the president, got wind of it. But they were saying this on the radio station, the student radio station. So they were feeling empowered. So again, what you call us isn't as important as how you make us feel. Is there hostility? And I can't imagine any woman of color in white spaces, especially in academic environment, that doesn't at some point experience a moment of racial violence.
In preparation for this call, you and I touched on some of this. And I found myself becoming a little, I try to be hyper vigilant in a conversation with a person of color to what their experiences are, and really always look through the lens of where am I coming from more of a dominant position given to me by society, by the nature of my skin color.
Yeah.
And in that conversation, of course, because this, it breaks my heart and I get emotional. And the fact that I can get emotional and I can cry about this, that is also a reflection of privilege. I see it that way.
I can see that.
I may be wrong. And I mean that in a public setting kind of thing. Because if we're having conversations, two girlfriends privately in our home, and you feel safe, you can get emotional. But in a public, and when I say public, I mean, like, obviously I hope that this space that you and I are in together would allow, if need be, you to be emotional, but that's not my point. My point in this is, if you're feeling defensive, and to your point about always kind of being on guard, because where's their violation going to be coming from? You become guarded, you become protective. There's not a lot of space for a real open heart to reflect itself through emotional intelligence, or emotional expression is maybe a better word. And I don't know if that's just my overinterpretation or oversensitivity, but I've noticed a lot of times when I have these conversations that I can see, if I look in a woman of color's eyes, I can see their pain, and they're like, oh, but there's also an element in the space that I feel where it's, well, yeah, what do you expect? I'm not going to get emotional because I got to be ready. I don't want to be weak. I don't want to be vulnerable. And I don't want to be further exploited.
Right.
And where's that going to come from? So that's also, it's the subtleties of it seem really...
Well, I mean, you've just said something very interesting. Look, at your inner critical race theorist is coming out too. So you just said something I think that was extremely interesting, and that is that your tears can be interpreted as a moment of privilege as well. And I'd like to say, yeah, I had considered it, but then I was thinking about the people who've written on white women's tears. And so your tears can do two things. In this setting, your tears are those of sorrow, empathy, sympathy. You want to do better. You're hurt for humanity. I get all of that. But if I were in a room with you and you and I did not have relationship and you began to cry, I would then come across to those who are looking on as the aggressor, the person who made you cry, you didn't have to mention those things that way. And I've actually seen that play out where the woman of color or the Black woman is then villainized because they made the white woman cry. And so that's another reason that one, those settings they can be very dangerous and injurious to me, but not in this setting. In this setting, it's, we're friends. We know each other. We understand.
Right. Well, yeah, thank you. I'll say thank you for that. Yeah. So I want to continue this conversation, but I'm seeing in the chat box a bunch of comments. So Brianna Lathorpe asks, why is this work, and I'm assuming she meant this conversation, considered to be toxic?
Toxic?
Yeah, I don't know if she means the word toxic, or maybe she was catching on to my initial, this could be a sensitive or charged conversation. I have
I see. I see. Because it can.
So can you share with us, so obviously in your position, you are constantly exposed to this kind of conversation where, I mean, it's charged or painful or sensitive, and you just said, well, because it can. Can you give an example or share more about that?
Sure. If anyone is aware of the identity politics that are being played out or that have been played out throughout American history, when one speaks of injustice, when one speaks of oppression, there's a moment of sensitivity. Oh, but that's my forefathers. It's not me. I didn't do it. I mean, we've seen the conversation even with the two sides of the conversation with those who follow American football. The NFL, Colin Kaepernick, decides to take a knee. He takes a knee to defend his right, one, First Amendment right, freedom of expression. He takes a knee also in protest to some of the ways in which Black bodies have been, treated, and the way people have just pretty much ignored Black folks, Black and brown folks, in ways that are very hostile. They're, shooting them and, strangling people and all sorts of things. And so Colin Kaepernick then says, until this injustice stops, I'm going to take a knee. Now, we don't know whether he was saying, I don't believe that the American flag represents me. That would be what I would say. And I know I'm going to get some pushback from that one. Or was he saying, I need the American flag to cover me and, for it to do better, the country to do better by all its citizenry? I suggest that he was probably saying the latter, wanting us to be more unified in how we execute the law and how we take care of others and how we look to those moments of oppression and poverty, and how we can police certain areas, but in a way that does not kill people, right? And so I think that was a challenge for him. The way it's been interpreted on the other side has been, and largely from, it was all of a sudden, it went from we can do better as a country, from that conversation to a very racialized, combative conversation. Now, if one were to really consider Francis Scott Key and what that song means, are you aware of some of the history of that song? Well, for those of you who don't know, Francis Scott Key, and I'm not sure of the war, but it was, I think, with the British. This was not a nice guy. Francis Scott Key, who is the composer of the song, or certainly the lyricist, or the guy who wrote the poem that the song was, eventually put to music. Parts of the song were a warning to his slaves that left slavery
Hold on, you're talking the national anthem, correct?
Yes, indeed. Yes, I am. Yes, I am. The one where Colin Kaepernick is taking a knee, right? So
Yep.
Francis Scott Key wrote this centuries ago. And as such, it wasn't just about patriotism. It was also a warning to slaves who were leaving slavery to go and fight in the opposition. They felt it was better to fight with the British than it was to remain a slave. And so there were certain things that there were messages that he was sending. It's not a good song. I don't even understand what the problem is, nor why America has embraced it in such a way as to ignore the underpinnings of the song. It's not a patriotic song. It's an awful song, if I can go that far. And if anyone were really, you don't have to be Black to think it's an awful song and to know its history. So I know everybody's going to go type in Francis Scott Key. And I think the best reference is the Smithsonian. The Smithsonian has a wonderful reference of that and history of that song. My point is, the two conversations have now become so polarizing and combative because of the identity politics around it, when in fact it didn't start that way. So this conversation, indeed, talking about things like Black women's identity, how we are oppressed, moments of empowerment, it can become, if not handled delicately, it can, thank you, I just saw that, Brion, the War of 1812, thank you. So it can become combative. It can become a moment of, well, that's not me. Why are you bringing that up again? How do we move forward? And those moments diminish me when we do that.
Well, that's like saying, oh, come on, Band-Aid. Who cares what color a Band-Aid is?
There you go.
You know, like, never mind. And it's
there you go.
Color, you know.
Yes.
So can you talk a little bit because there's lots of things I would like us to get to today, but you just touched on something very, very important too, which is about knowing our history. And who knew, if people knew the history of the national anthem, never mind whether you think it's a good song or good whatever, that's, if you understand the context of it, then it enables a more realistic conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk a little bit about how the what's the way to say this? Things that have been, I was going to say whitewashed, and that is in fact exactly the term I mean, in our history that have partially, I'm going to open a huge, huge door here.
That's okay. Let's walk through it. Come on.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. No, I just mean that it's a big door that there's lots of information though. Can you talk a little bit about U.S. history and as from maybe a Reconstructionist understanding to where we got today? I know that you had shared with me in our pre-conversation a little bit about some of your previous work around educating people around Reconstructionist history and its implications for today.
Yes. Thanks. That's a good question because it brings us up to 2017 November. Some of the things that we are seeing, I was just saying actually to my family last night that it seems that our current government is all about taking things away from people. And I don't understand that. And then I kind of thought, yeah, we've been there before. So if we look at how America was built, one of your participants just put something up that was very interesting and very true. America, as we know it, was built on oppression. If you think about it, when people landed here, they killed the people that were here already, right? And as a matter of fact, I found a quote even from Christopher Columbus, and where he sent back to the king that I guess was Ferdinand or someone, that his quote, and one of your participants can look it up, but he was saying they are well built. Speaking of the First Nation people or the Native Americans, whatever you want to call them, they're well built. They don't know of weapons. One of them impaled themselves trying to grab the sword from the wrong side. They're peaceful people. And with 50 men, we could conquer them all and make them do for us what they will. There were also moments of quotes from Columbus where he talked about how he subdued their women. He was a barbarian, but we celebrate his mistakenly bumping into this place thinking it was somewhere else, and how and through white supremacy, he took over a nation, okay, and created one. Then we start thinking about how slavery began, again, a happy accident for many. It wasn't a well thought out plan until it became a plan. But the first slaves were indentured servants working off a debt. Some were white, most were of color, but they could work off these debts and be landowners. And then one thing led to another, and they started with the indentured servitude of others. Slavery, and I will send you a link later, slavery was by far one of the most lucrative things that America has ever done, right? And the other piece of that is that slavery in some ways was the way, and we are seeing this conversation now in the South, was the one way that the South actually was able to help themselves to build a little bit, right? What we find through the Reconstruction is a reticence, a pushback, an opposition to give freed slaves equal rights, voice, property. They didn't want to do that because the South would fall if that were to happen. So when people say, oh, the Civil War was about states' rights, yes, it was. It was about the states' rights to own slaves. So it was not about, I just want to be this independent, free-willing kind of place. They wanted the right to own another body, to own people, and to treat them as property and chattel. Now, once they lost that, and I think many people forget that the Civil War was lost by the South, and that the South, with this battle flag and the Confederate flag, they talk about, this is my Southern pride, or even I see them up north and they talk about it. And I often wonder, do you realize that you're on the wrong side of this thing? Because these were the rebels, and they would, they would today be, I think, tried for treason. These were not good people in the South with this, the battle flag and all of this. Anyway, we have the Civil War. The North wins, thankfully. And my ancestors then have opportunities to do things that they didn't have before, like own property and to serve as, I have one great relative who was a constable in Louisiana, and they were able to do things that they were not able to do before. So their freedom came with, allegedly, the full rights and responsibilities of any citizen. But because of the oppressive nature of the American government, what we ended up with were states who said, I don't want to run afoul of the 14th Amendment, but I will handle my state as I see fit. There were some states, you must remember, that had more freed slaves than white people. North Carolina, I believe there was a 49 or 51% African Americans at that time, or Negroes at that time. A lot of them, there were far more people of color than there were white folks. So there was a reason for fear on their part, a sincere reason. I have to now assume that these people that I have owned and treated badly now have the right to own arms, guns, and the right to be educated, and the right to vote, which is the most important one. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, of course, we ended up with pushback. So you had a president, Andrew Johnson, I believe at the time, who kept vetoing the first Civil Rights Bill of 1888. he believed that it was the wrong thing. Some of the rhetoric, some of the posters, some of the writings were so abhorrent, the things that they said, to convince the Senate that in fact a vote for this would be the destruction of the United States. So this president continued to veto this bill. Eventually it just didn't go very far. But we had things like the Freedmen's Act and other things, and I don't want to bore you and get into too much detail. I feel I already have. But what I'd like to say, oh, sorry.
No, you haven't bored me. It's really necessary and important to understand this. And I just caught a glimpse of the time. So I'm interrupting you to yes, I want you to finish your thought if you can remember it now that I just.
Yes, I can. Yes, I can.
And
then
and then maybe what we can do is we can send either articles or recommended reading on this topic, because for those who feel compelled to really get into this, which is necessary, right, to get our history so we can understand from where we came and to where we're going.
I would love that. I would love that. And I love your participant. Is it Brione or Brione? Yeah. She's putting some very interesting things out there. Thank you so much. She's a wonderful researcher.
Yeah, so I'm going to just add that this chat conversation will be saved also and included in the follow-up email with a recording of this video.
So I will finish up. So when there was pushback from the southern states, they said, look, I don't want to run afoul. I will lose my seat in the Senate if I don't do what I meant to do, but we'll handle our former slaves, our Black people. And they did. And there was then the emergence of Black codes. Black codes and pig laws and things of that nature, meant to further oppress. And you're saying, what is pig laws and what's Black codes?
Hold on. You just put Black codes and pig laws, and I'm assuming you're talking about livestock farming.
I am, but in this context, pig laws were for not the pigs, but for Black people who may have stolen a pig to feed their family, and then they were either hung or put into indentured servitude again. You had to call it an indentured servitude then. You couldn't call it slavery, right? Or they call it something else. So you had to work off that that debt, pig laws. You also had the Black codes, which are things that in certain towns you weren't allowed to have certain jobs. So they felt, well, whilst the federal government has instructed us to have certain laws and boundaries, we are going to create our own. And then when those didn't work and did not keep the progress from happening, we then have Jim Crow laws. And when those two did not work, what they went to was violence. And we all know about lynching laws, and we all know about the nadir, really, of race relations in America in the 1920s, where Black people were being lynched at this inordinate rate. And it was horrible, but it was also a moment of, let's keep them in their place, because, you know, in the South, this is what we need. They're out of control now. And it wasn't that they were doing anything except trying to reach levels of civilization that they had been kept away from them, right? They hadn't been permitted to have these things previously, but now with slavery and the emancipation, there were these opportunities for them. And so you would find situations where a young woman may be raped, but lynched because she may have talked back to someone who cheated her in a store. No, go ahead.
Go ahead. I'm going to use this as a point of I'm going to put a pause, and there will definitely be follow-up reading. And the reason I'm putting a pause here is because this ties into a play that you sent me, written in 1929, about the lynchings and about people who were actually trying to build their life. Can we transition? Can we pivot to that?
Yes. Yes, we
Is
can.
that okay? But I'm cutting. I don't. I also want to be respectful and not
No, no, no,
cut
no.
you up.
It's
Okay.
too much for an hour and a half.
Yeah.
So,
Okay. So,
yeah.
and then I realized also we didn't talk about getting from all of this into the sustainability goals, which are also touching on global issues. But going back here, because I also put this out in our initial conversation of inviting people to participate in this. 1929, there was a play written called Safe. Can you tell us a little bit about that play?
I
And
can. Your readers, I don't know that, that we should encourage them to read it, but
well, actually, maybe we should.
well, that's a good point. Um, so Georgia Douglas Johnson wrote a play about what was going on during that time. As we know, that's what most writers do. They write about what they know. Um, Safe is a play that discusses infanticide. And infanticide is something that in the Black community you are aware of if you study this. And everyone read Beloved and all of that, and they, kind of understood in concept where that was going. This is not as nuanced as Beloved. It is, wouldn't you say, Lisa, it's not quite as nuanced?
No. And for those who are not familiar with the term infanticide, it means killing your baby or the death of a newborn. Is that?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yes. This would happen in communities where they would feel, I cannot let this child live because they'll live to be a slave, or they'll live to be beaten, lynched, raped. So I wouldn't say that, I can't speak for other cultures, although I know it does still go on in some cultures, but I can speak to my own. And in America, there was a time when women may not wish to see their child live to be a slave or to be hung. So in this play, it really is very short, and it speaks to a family, a nuclear family, a wife, a husband, and her mother. And she's, heavily pregnant. She's about to deliver. But there's a side conversation about a young man in town who, it's been a minute since I read it. He either argued with his foreman or slapped his foreman back because he was hit and he hit back. And he left his job, and later that afternoon, a lynch mob came and lynched him. But this pregnant woman is now in labor, and she can hear this through her window. And it was just too much for her.
And let's just take half a second and let that sink in, especially for people who have children. You're pregnant, you're about to give birth to this amazing new being into the world.
Mm.
A person of your same socioeconomic status, we'll say it like that, and racial profile is outside your window because somebody violated him and he stood up, maybe a little aggressively, but still rightfully, what I would probably say, and how the play alludes to, rightfully, that he was defending himself, and as a result goes to get hung. So you're about to give life, and somebody outside, for standing up for themselves, has a mob chasing them down the street, and he's killed, basically outside your window.
Right.
And I can't imagine you have life and violent death occurring, and then is this the future for your child? And that's kind of alluded to. And by the way, if you're trying to find for those who are Googling the play, it's really hard to find. So we will include a copy of that in the follow-up email with the recording of this conversation. So let's just, again, she's given birth, right?
Right.
And
birth. And the only white character that you really understand is white, aside from the people that are in the lynch mob, is the doctor. And the husband and the mom are outside waiting to hear what's happening. And then the doctor has to tell them that he said something like, I just turned around. And during that very short period of time, she decided to take the life of her infant, newly born infant, because she did not want him to be subjected to that. And I think the last thing she says is, he's safe now. You're safe now. And that is the name of the play. So, and it is very powerful. It's a lot to take.
You had told me about it, and I was like, okay, I'm ready to read it. And then I sat there with it, and it's like a 5-page play. And, you know, I was left without words. Like, I can't imagine what that experience. And the thing is, at first you say, oh, well, that was 1929, you know, come on, that was, and this is also this, you know, I'm coming from a perspective of a white person who tries to live a life of raising all humans so that we're on an equal playing field. But you said something to me very profound that has another rattle me to my core moment, which is that, you know, pretty much every Black woman or woman of color, certainly in the United States, has a moment where they think, not just what's the future for my child, but what's the future for my child, as a white woman, I think, what's the future of my child? And I can easily dream into what that could be, and happiness and joy and whatever. But you talked about something very different. I don't want to put words in your mouth. So are you open to sharing some of that? Or?
Sure. Yes, sure. I mean, I'm a mother, so that motivates so much of how I navigate the world. And I have to say that there is not a day when I don't think of their safety. They are twins. They're 23. And one girl and a boy, and I am concerned hourly for their safety. They have acculturated beautifully to being in America, and they're good, kind, bright, intelligent, gorgeous children to me. I'm the mom. But I don't know that the world sees them that way. The world sees them as Black bodies. And so, I mean, I've had situations already. I'll just share this one. I live in a very small college town, and my children probably were 12 or 13 when they got their first cell phone. So I was one of those strict moms. No, you're not getting a cell phone until you are this age and blah, blah. And I remembered my son playing with his in the morning. He dialed 999 because that is the emergency number for England, where he grew up. But he was in America and it was 911. And so I said, no, honey, 999 is not the number, it's 911. He dialed it. And then he said, oh, I'm sorry. And he hung up. Again, getting ready for breakfast, not a big deal. And I live in a town of only 5,000 people, so it's not like people don't know who you are. I think there might have been 2, possibly 3 police officers at the time. My doorbell rang, and it was a police officer. And I thought, And my son answered the door, and he was talking to the police officer, and he said, oh, I'm sorry, I dialed it by mistake. My mom told me, kid, not thinking anything of it. But this police officer was really trying to intimidate, I don't know, or he was inappropriate. He was asking my son, what's your social security number? What's your name? And he was treating him, he was criminalizing an innocent moment, right? I had to get the kids off to school, and then I went to the police station, and I said, don't ever do that again. My children are not meant to fear you. What you did was a teachable moment that went really wrong. You could have handled that in any number of ways. I have to wonder if you didn't come there to intimidate him because he's a Black boy. We are not those parents. You cannot do that to us. So I remembered that moment. I'll never forget the moment. So my son isn't allowed to make mistakes. And he's not a bad kid. He really was dialing 999 and he said, oh, no, it's 911. And he said, oh, when someone answered and he hung up, realizing someone will pick up. I can't do that. It really could have been a nothing, but it turned out to be an incident which he will always remember, that a police officer came to his door at 7:30 in the morning before he was going to school. So those are moments that I know are motivated by race in the United States. I don't want them to take a foot wrong. I don't buy hoodies for my children. I tell them they can't wear them. So, am I over the top? No, I'm not. I'm sure that Trayvon Martin's mom wishes he hadn't had on a hoodie. Right?
Well, right. And to your point, I have a exquisite, how old is she? I think she's 25-year-old Black friend. And she has this adorable son who is 5, I think. He's biracial. And no, 3. What am I saying? 5. Sorry, I don't mean to raise him so quickly. And he's 3. And she said to me, she was at a store in a mall, and this was in California. And so she went, I think it was, I don't want to get into name stores. She went into a big box store, bought her stuff, went out into the parking lot, put her son in his safety seat, opened the trunk to put her things in the back, and all of a sudden and this was just a few months ago again, so it's relevant, right? So she came out, and 2 or 3 cops came over to her and basically like pinned her arms against her and like said, what were you doing and what did you buy and let's see the receipt. And she was completely freaked out because she's like, what's going on? I had the receipt in my car and like this. And in the meantime, her son is watching this. And she's saying, and it turns out they said, well, we're sorry, but you fit the description of someone that just stole something in that same store. And she said, what was that description? And they said, a Black woman. And
okay.
And she's like, yes, and how many Black women do you see around here? And right. There were Black women. It was a very diverse community. And she looked, and she could see her son's face of terror because his mommy was being attacked by 2 policemen.
Yes.
And she said to them, you need to stop right now because you are terrifying my son and I have done nothing wrong. And one of them muttered under his breath, well, it's about time he get terrified and know who's really in charge.
Exactly.
So this is happening today.
Yes.
In a liberal state. And so I went to her and I asked her, okay, so have you read this play, Safe, about infanticide? Because the mother chooses her child is safer in this context than living in today's world. And I had her read it. She was devastated. And she said, I'm crying because that play put sorry.
No, it's okay.
That play articulated a feeling that I had that I couldn't articulate. I couldn't understand why I was terrified. And she said, and I thought I was such a bad person because at one point I actually thought maybe I should have an abortion. It's not too late because I don't know the world that this child is bringing. And just for the record, this woman lives in a very socioeconomically stable environment, etc. So it's still today. And she's a 20-something-year-old young woman.
Yes. If I could just say, and I don't mean to cut you off, but I just wanted to say, I believe we are hardwired because of our history in this country. I believe that we're hardwired to protect our family, how we protect our family. I believe we are hardwired to, the research is showing that Black women in particular, especially those who are upwardly mobile, are having far more miscarriages because of the stress that we're under, higher rates of heart attack, higher rates of everything bad, right? And I believe that hardwiring comes from our centuries of oppression. And so I understand that she didn't know what that was about, what that feeling was. I too have had it. She didn't know what it was. And she did feel like a bad person for having it, because she's looking at her colleagues and she goes to the baby classes, and all the white moms in her socioeconomic class are happy. And they don't have those thoughts. Society is going to treat their children well, but it isn't going to treat our children well. And that is something we have to think about. So there's a hard wiring. Unfortunately, there's nothing we can do about it, but I think it's there.
So I'm like, so in all of our calls, we look at how the subjects are touched on the UN Sustainability Goals, and I'm struggling now because I'm like thinking I'm in such sort of a heart-centered and deeper space that to go into the different systems and looking at this a little bit. I'm also aware of time, but I do want to just go to them a little bit, because this is an important part of how we at Charter for Compassion, and especially the Women and Girls, are looking at what is the role of women's leadership, and how can we change this. And to the point of this conversation, and I'm going to put the sustainability goals on our screen now, and to the point of how do we change this, and also because women's leadership style is generally more inclusive and engaging. What is the role that we as women, and how as we as women, both women of color and white women, because we have the power to unify, heal, and unite. So do men too. I'm not putting men out, but in particular women, and on this subject of nurturingness and healing. When we look at the sustainability goals, when we look at racism, and I'm just sort of looking now, no poverty. I mean, pretty much every one of these subjects, zero hunger, well, no poverty. I mean, racism, there's a huge racial component around who's living in a space of poverty, both in the States, but also globally. Mm-hmm. And that no poverty then lays for pretty much, zero hunger. Well, we're kind of in that if you're in poverty. Good health and well-being. We know that, and you even just made reference to it, that women of color struggle with a lot more health issues than most white women. Education, I mean, we can go through, a lot of times what we get into in these reaction to response calls is our subject matter pretty much touches on every single one of these goals. Right? Is there anything that jumps out at you here?
1, 3, 4, 5, 16, 17 in particular, because, and 10, because in order for there to be real equity for Black women, and for our voices to be raised in such a way that they can be heard, appreciated, and things can be done, right, in a way that is uplifting to us, we need our white sisters to recognize that sometimes they have been obstructive to that progress, and to really make it a true partnership. I love having those conversations about the feminist movement and then womanist responses. You see, the feminist movement did not care about me. And the feminist movement was not indeed for me. And I believe now it has become more, it's widened the participation, it's become more inclusive of women's experiences generally. And there still is some work that needs doing. There really is, when it comes to work that needs to be done around the areas of understanding the lived experiences of Black women, and not always Black women in Black spaces, but Black women in white spaces. That is very different. Those are moments that where our white sisters can be most helpful, and where we have probably, I can certainly speak for myself, have certainly experienced the most obstruction and oppression.
Wow. Okay, so I'm gonna pause here because you're reminding me. Well, two things. One, we're at 9:05, so we've gone a few minutes over.
Oh,
So, but that's okay, because I'm going to jump to one thing, and then we're going to bring everybody else who's already on the call into this conversation. But one of the conversations that have come up in we had oh gosh, I forget. I remember who was our guest speaker. We were talking about, there we go. We were talking about, this is back in September, International Day of Peace and building traditional and human security. And we were speaking with Bob Zuber of Global Action to Prevent War and Armed Conflict. And it came up through a conversation between he and Sandy and I about how do we change all of this. Well, and Sandy being Sandy Hart, director of Women and Girls Sector, and she suggested, well, we really need an 18th goal, which is self-awareness and personal agency. And to your point, we need white sisters, we need white people to open the door. This is where, you know, we really get into the role of the individual in the collective. And
yes, I like that you said that. The part of the opening the door, and I don't mean to cut you off, and I hope you remember your point, but it's such an important point that you just made. Sometimes, as a Black woman, I just need you to stand next to me and let me open the door. Sometimes I need you to say, you know what? You have been kept from this room. You don't even know what's behind the door. Let me tell you. If you go through this door, this is what will happen. Give me the choice, but arm me with the information. And what I know to be true is that our white sisters have experiences in areas, and they don't always share. There are things that I know about, let's say, higher ed, because I'm curious. I have a kind of stick-to-itive nature. I'm nosy, so I'm going to keep digging until I get what I want. That's not always the case. And sometimes I'll get to the place of, oh, this is the land of milk and honey, but then the door shuts. Not only does the door shut, but they construct a wall, right? It would be nice if our sisters, our white sisters, who are in those rooms and in those spaces, open the spaces up to us. I can do my own work, but open the door. Right? Or at least say, go through that door. You know, at least provide some guidance. I don't want it to be that type of missionary approach where, well, you know, I have to do this for them. No, you don't. These are capable women. They just need you to not be obstructive to their progress. Do you know what I mean? To stand with them, side by side with them. Yeah? Don't walk in front of them, but side by side.
That is exquisitely said, and thank you. I think that we can use this as a point to invite, there's about another 7, 8, 9 people who are—
oh my, okay.
And so we can go ahead and invite them to join us. And so we have behind the scenes, we have a whole bunch of people about to enter here now. So welcome everyone. I will just say this. We are moving into a space where we have shared conversation space. I'm going to be very clear here, though, that we're keeping it to a little bit of a minimum point of conversation. So anybody and everybody that wants to have something to say can say so. And I'm going to apologize in advance if I get a little bit interrupting by cutting people off, because I want to give people the space, and I do want to try and keep this to no more than till 9. Armenta, can you be with us until 9:45? Is it that? Okay. So yeah, and on that, I'm just going to say thank you for sharing time with us. Just a little bit of housekeeping things. We're still being recorded, I believe. And everyone's microphone is on mute. We're going to ask that you keep your microphone on mute until you are speaking. And actually, Yeah, why don't we go ahead and do that? So you can, anybody have, Cindy, I see you're smiling, do you want to?
Well, just back to a little bit of housekeeping also, and to let those of you on the call know, if you've never been on Zoom before, in the upper right-hand corner of your screen, if you float your cursor up, you can change your speaker view. I prefer to see everybody at once, like what I call the Brady Bunch view, where we're all on the same screen together. Otherwise, you can't see everybody. So that's all I wanted to say, other than my heartfelt, deep gratitude to you, Armenta, and to Lisa as well, for opening this conversation. This is you didn't make it sound like a difficult dialogue, but for so many of the world, it really is, particularly in the United States, a very difficult dialogue. And my personal experience, if I could share that here, and perhaps hear your suggestion and your wisdom on how to move forward. A few years ago, I reached out to a very good friend of mine who happens to be a white woman who was a minister at an AME church. And I said, I've been struggling with this my whole life. I was raised in a predominantly Protestant white community. The only diversity in the community was you were either Protestant or Catholic, and blonde. Well, I was brunette, woman of Jewish religion, and I had brown hair. And so I never really associated myself as being what I always thought was white. And I mean that with absolute sensitivity and respect, but I'm just being candid and honest with the first half of my young life was spent in this understanding that I didn't belong in this environment. And I didn't understand it until I went and worked in downtown Los Angeles, and my eyes were open to what real diversity looked like and my role in perpetuating certain behaviors. So I wanted to start a conversation. I've always felt a pushback from women of color, particularly older women of color, not wanting to have anything to do with me and not seeing me for who I was. And now I completely understood that and respect that entirely, and see how I was projecting myself too. Now I understand the filters from both myself and I'm going to assume from what I was seeing from them, and saw my role in that, what I was receiving from them. So I really wanted to start this conversation, not just to provide that space, to open that door, to provide that place in the community as a community builder where I live, particularly on the ground, but also from my own understanding too. It was very self-serving. I couldn't get anybody to show up. So I then reached out to my friend and really started my journey on really unpacking what this is like. I really want to have these conversations. This conversation today was a treasure. I think it's the beginning of a really important conversation that perhaps we can inspire women to start having more of in a safe place. So are there any guidelines besides circle principles and dialogue for respect? How can we really start this conversation? You've mentioned a number of articles and books and things in play even that we can do, but is there anything out in the world that will help guide this conversation?
I can't help but just say you are very brave to have shared that. Thank you. And it must be kind of difficult. I hear there's something else there, and there's some pain there. Yeah. And I'm happy to talk about it privately if you want, but I could hear that there were some things. But having said that, the one thing that I appreciate the most is authenticity. I don't give anyone any pushback if you bring your authentic self to me, to the conversation. Let's be aware that of our space. I know that in these spaces you have privileges I don't. I'm okay with that. And if you want to have a conversation and get to know me and find ways that we have commonality and find ways where we can find that sisterhood, yeah, because it's there, right? That's okay, but don't bring your privilege to it. See, because I recognize your privilege already.
Oh, and I do too. It's a
Right.
hard, yeah. And
Right.
yeah.
So just not navigating in that space of privilege. The one thing that I think that a lot of people mention is, well, I know my privilege, and I was talking to a colleague just today, as I was saying, who was talking about white privilege, and she was saying that there was an example that a student gave her of privilege. It had something to do with religion, and she felt disprivileged in a certain environment because her religion was not represented. Yeah. A person I'll take myself. I grew up in the South, and my hometown is now in the news, Montgomery, Alabama. So, yeah, I mean, and someone in my role, I shouldn't be laughing, but it's a ridiculous story in Montgomery. And I grew up in an area where my parents were civil rights activists. I too went to a single, not single sex, but single race school all my life, including my college. I went to a historically Black college and university. In some ways, it was like America's apartheid, but I didn't feel that until I went to graduate school, where I did recognize there are some serious differences. I was in a middle-class Black family, which means something very different with a middle-class white family. Socioeconomically, I don't even understand how my parents were able to live the way that they did and raise us the way that they did. But if you and I had met during those times, for you to recognize your privilege before you get to me is that's good. Don't do it in front of me, because when you do it in front of me, it's oppressive. So those are the moments. I mean, I think that it's just bringing your authentic self to those moments and understanding where everyone is. On a human level, I think we want to all get along. Wouldn't you find that that's really what we want? Yeah.
I'm going to just ask you a question here, Armenta, and I just lost it. You just said something that rang red flags, and coming off of Sandy's point also, and I'd love to hear other people's comments too, but that if you you just said, know your privilege before you come into my space, because that's oppressive. But don't do it in front of me, if I heard you correctly.
Yes, that's what I said.
Yeah.
Yes.
So that's a really, really big deal, because how, as a woman who, as a white woman of privilege, because I'm white, okay, I get that. But until I actually had these conversations, I didn't get it. So
right.
That means know what we don't know, right?
Right. We know what we don't know. How do we get like that? Oh, I need to be like looking at myself. If I can't initially anyway, do it with you and probably in front of you.
Yeah.
Oh, I see what you're saying. How do you learn it? I get it.
Right. And that was what I was saying. Is there anything to prime and then prepare and then guide a conversation in this way? Is this something?
Can I say something?
Yeah.
Not yet, Lynn. Hold on, please. Sorry.
And I don't want to take up more airtime, because this could be a much bigger conversation.
It could.
Something we need to take offline and create it.
I was just about to say that. I think it's something that maybe the three of us need to think about, a toolbox.
So hold on there. I'm going to just put a pause here, because I hope, Bree, that you are okay, that I'm about to call you out. As another woman of color, you're muted. You're muted. I'm calling you out. That sounds actually like a derogatory term.
Just get to it, sweetie. We're good.
As another woman of color, your voice in this conversation is very relevant. So is there anything at this point you would like to add to this conversation?
Well, Armenta, thank you so much. She's touched on so many things, and then, we moved on to other things. And when at the beginning of the conversation, she was talking about academia and how women of color, not just Black women, but women of color in general, can be terrorized in those spaces. And I went back to this piece about this young kid, freshman this year, and her roommate was systematically poisoning her all year to get her out of the.
You saw that?
Yeah.
Yes, it was horrible.
Yeah, she's Black, so she's going to she's putting mold in her food. She's putting nasty tampons on her clothing, and systematically poisoned her because of her color, not because of her, she was a bad roommate, but because of her color. You're starting at the beginning of your academic career where you have this, what should have been an amazing experience, and this will be with her for the rest of her life. And then after, and the girl is, she convicted herself because she blasted it out on social media. She was only charged with a misdemeanor crime.
That's right.
For systematically poisoning this girl for months, harassing her, terrorizing her, and she was charged with a misdemeanor crime. So when you talk about privilege, if that had been someone of color, they would be up under the jail, nonstop. It would be a non-conversation. But the fact that she wasn't, she's charged with a misdemeanor for endangering someone's life.
So, yeah, let's sink in for a second.
That's powerful. It's a powerful example of privilege. It was a liberal arts private college in Connecticut. That's right. And she was able to obviously afford legal counsel. And she may be from a very moneyed environment. And they were able to probably plead, to something lesser if she admitted it, although she had already on social media. I mean, there are so many layers to the privilege of that encounter. And it is one of those moments where, as I am a administrator in a liberal arts environment, I don't know what I'm going to face on an hourly basis. I just don't know. A student may call me the N-word, or a faculty member may say something that is condescending with racial undertones. You just overtones. You just don't know. And you have to be prepared. And I have to say, it's crazy making, and it gets to a point where you can never be your best self. I call it shrink to fit. We can never bring our whole selves to work, ever.
Well, so that's an interesting comment, and because I think a lot of people shrink to fit, and I think there's another layer around race. I mean, I'm having these kinds of conversations about shrink to fit, and certainly we see it in the social societal structures that we've built, which are predominantly hierarchical, patriarchal, and yes, phallocratic. And so, yeah, and we certainly see that in the US as exhibited by our present administration, which is predominantly white men.
And I wanted to add one more thing, and I think it's really critical, if we're talking not just as women of color, but this conversation in general. And I feel it really strongly, living overseas and looking in, I'm as an American looking in, but being horrified at the picture from inside and from abroad. When you see all the polarization of race right now, and how it's become so acceptable to be completely inappropriate. And that level of inappropriateness is becoming the new standard. And that we still can't have an open conversation about the fact that the country was built on the concept of white supremacy. And that all of the pushback that we're seeing, the legislative pushback, the policies that are being designed to infringe on the people who are the most vulnerable in our societies, it's still based upon this concept of white supremacy, and this pushback of having this uppity Negro who aspired to the presidency acquired the presidency, and now we have to erase anything and any kind of progress that was made there. And no one has that conversation, you know. And even when I think Lisa, you mentioned your friend and that horrible incident at the grocery store, and then the cop saying under his breath, well, now he should be afraid so he knows what the situation is. And, you know, the fact that the FBI, they made a report in 2006 indicating that white supremacist organizations were systematically infiltrating law enforcement around the country. In 2006, this is 2017, 11 years later, they made the report, but they've done nothing to address the fact that white supremacists are infiltrating law enforcement around the country. And then we see all these dead bodies just dropping one by one and people walk away without any kind of reprimand. It's like, oh, okay. So yeah, I just had to get those two major things off.
I'm so glad you said that, because, you know, there has become a level of acceptance of this type of thing, even on college campuses. There's a group out there, I don't want to give them any airtime, but I can, you know, send you a link, that is infiltrating the college campuses, and they're the group that organized the Charlottesville march. Mm-hmm. And they are not what you expect. These are well-groomed jobs. These are people with jobs or middle class that are saying, we're going to take our country back, and I'm back from home. I mean, I'm not really quite sure what going with this.
Right. Thank you.
I'm going to put a pause here for 1 second. Okay, stay where we are, but I need to just address, I speak what's going on in my own body, but I'm watching all of the other white faces here, and I'll speak about myself, but watching body language, I'm feeling so uncomfortable right now. Like my body, I want to change the subject. I want to get up and start moving. Okay. And I'm just like, holy, you know, really?
Okay, I'm sorry.
No. On the contrary, don't apologize to me. Don't. I'm talking about, because there's nothing, you're right. And the two women of color are deeply engaged here. And I even almost hesitated to interject, because why am I interjecting? But I wanted to take a minute for those of us here, or maybe who are watching later on. If this conversation gets you moving, thinking about emails and feeling uncomfortable in your body, let's just pause for half a second and take a breath and feel what's going on in our bodies. Because for many white people, this pivotal point here is where we check out.
Well, can I find out why? See, that's where the conversation generally ends. Right. And I don't want that to happen.
Me neither. That's why I put a pause here.
Yeah. Why would they? Can I find out the why?
Well, I can tell you what I'm where, because I was processing this quite quickly here, and I'd be curious other people's experience. It made me uncomfortable because, okay, so it's uncomfortable because I don't want to think that white people are doing this. I don't like this. It's very primal and base, okay? So I'm going to express it as I feel it. Oh, I don't like this. I don't want to hear about this. This is nonsense. That's not true. It's just not true. Come on. That's not my experience. You guys are just a small minority. What are you talking? This is the BS going through my head. No, it's not in my head. Yeah, well, it is. It's in the consciousness. Mm-hmm. It's not what I know to be true. And I'm feeling very, very uncomfortable right now in even saying this. Because I, Lisa, who have done a fair amount of work on this subject, am very uncomfortable with that. I can even hear those words in my head. And in my body, it's more in my body, because my mind is engaged with you. But I was watching there's only 5 of us white people here. You two were riveted. And all 5 of us were like looking at other things somewhat and just getting some of us were nodding because we knew it's true, but the body language, and okay, it's only head, but the vibe, it's different. And I asked myself, well, what am I feeling? So Sandy, other white people on this conversation, where are you in your body in this conversation, and where are you in your being?
This has been a conversation that I've been having with myself for 25 years.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I'm baffled. I think that, you know, Lisa and I have talked about this word called communal neural pathway. You know, the norms of a community, the norms, that's embedded norms that are so deeply ingrained and sheathed over. How do we disrupt the pattern? How do we break the system of this understanding? What can we do? And it seems daunting. So mine isn't, I can't accept it. Mine, and so I had a different experience. I'm like, yeah, but what can I do? I'm seriously begging for a solution. I think perhaps a programming. I mean, I'm a take charge person. I want to get out in there and develop a platform that people can have the tools. I love the idea of a toolbox. So for me, it's like, I need to be empowered so I can really know. Perhaps if you witnessed anything in me that I'm not aware of subconsciously, maybe I'm willing to take one, you know, I accept responsibility on behalf of my skin color. This is such a tangled conversation. It's so multidimensional. It really is, you know, because me struggling with my own whiteness, I get it. I think I get it. It's like, what can you do about it? So I'd like to hear from others.
Yeah. Lynn, you're muted. And Lynn, hold on one second. We're not looking for solutions. I know you have brilliant ideas, and they really are. But right now, what is your experience in this conversation?
Okay, let me tell you.
Yeah.
Okay. My conversation in this, or my feelings, are that I'm Native American, and I have Black in my culture too, in my family, and European white, and definitely the male patriarchy that's been kind of running the shows here, programs on the planet, especially in our Congress. The male that I lived with, that I actually was married to, was beyond abusive. I mean, trying to commit and kill. And most of the white women I know were actually, if they're coming from a somewhat poor background and considered white, the abuse was beyond any of at least the Black women that I knew during my last 60 years. Just wanted to get that out there. Thanks. Or Native Americans too. They've really been even more degraded in that part of my family. So thanks.
And please, Bernadette. Oh, you're on mute. Bernadette, we don't hear you. No, don't hear you yet.
Hello?
Now we hear you.
Okay. I'm with Sandy, and I've been doing an awful lot of work with stress management, mindfulness, and all of that. And I have the profound sadness that I have felt.
Oh, you muted. You muted again.
Try muting and unmuting yourself. That seemed to work last time.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. So even listening to Armenta and how do we move forward? And I love your shrink to fit analogy. And how do we empower women? Because
you keep breaking up. We don't hear you.
And that's a shame, because I know she's got something really good to say, right?
You know, it seems like this, okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. So, you know, this profound sadness that I've experienced, and then just looking at the cultural environment is how
We don't hear you. We lost you again.
She's having microphone problems, I think.
Yeah. Don't know. We don't hear you.
Can you encourage her to send you her typed response?
Yeah,
I'd
exactly.
really like to know what she had to say.
Okay, sure. Yeah.
Well, there, now we hear you. I think it would be better to either have it typed and then we can hear the full thought.
Okay. It seems like there's a little yellow box that's around me when I'm talking, but for whatever reason, it goes away. So I'm not quite sure what's going on. But anyways, bottom line is that how do we keep empowering women? And you know, the reality is black or white, we're all.
So can everyone else maybe mute our microphones and see if that helps?
No, it's coming from Bernadette's computer. I can tell. So yeah,
I will.
Yeah. Let's see. The yellow box means we can hear you. So try it again.
All right. Well, so how do we come together as women, as oppressed women? And because, you know, we've just had the vote for 100 years. And how do we now begin to use that?
Mm.
She has some juicy stuff.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we need another call.
Yeah.
Maybe she can just chat, put it in the chat window.
Right.
Now.
Bernadette, can you hear us? Okay, can you chat your comments and your wisdom and so how we can connect with you after the call?
And so I just want to go back to this because I want to be sure that Armenta and Bree get to finish the thought because I interjected this. And for the record, just, and this is my own, like, I don't know what, absolutely within that there is the what are we going to do, but then and the anger. But for me, I go through the different layers to get to my own truth because part of my or what I experience as different layers, which is like, what's the collective saying about this? What am I catching that's in my skin and in my body and in the cells of my body? And what is the resistance? And we have to, in order to get to the place where Sandy and Bernadette are talking about, and Lynn as well, about what do we do and how are we going to go, we also have to be able, as a society, I'm talking now, to go through to first acknowledge, like we talked about, our history, right? What's the resistance? What is it that shifts? When people say this isn't true, what is this bullshit? What did it again? Sorry. If we can find the place where the conversation pivots and acknowledge the resistance and what is the resistance and what are the language and what's the pain underneath it? Because it is collective trauma. Mm-hmm. It is collective pain. And you repress one. Sorry, I have on the subject of collective pain, I have an ill kitty who's sitting on my lap. If we work with the collective trauma and listen to what our sisters are saying, and I'm going to shut up now because you have the wisdom. And to the point of toolboxes that need to be built, you have to guide us on what the tools are and what are the tools that we can bring to give you the tools, to your point. I do want to just say one other thing too, is that on the 29th, we'll be sitting with two women, one a black woman and one a white woman. And the white woman, Abigail Rose, is actually teaching a course right now for intended, I think, white cis women, white women basically, to give them the tools to elevate our sisters of color. So this toolbox, as I know of, has already been started, and I would love for us all to be able to increase that conversation. Anyway.
Well, I want to just jump in because earlier, Armenta, you mentioned the women's movement. The women's movement of the 60s or early 70s, and the feminist movement, I should say, and I don't know if she finished that thought, but from all intents and purposes, from the African American community to the Black community, that was seen as a way of diluting the civil rights movement, and actually derailing the civil rights movement. So, you know, I think that's something that needs to be unpacked and discussed as well.
Which part was the dilution, bringing in the women's movement? Yeah. It's very much like today, you know, I don't know if you have experienced this at any of the colleges or anything, or communities. Whenever they, especially at universities now, want to celebrate MLK Day, they make it a day of service, right? That's not what any of this is about. I mean, yes, service is a part of it, but there's a way in which American society will dilute the thing that is celebratory or that is addressing a particular need and or answer to a problem within the Black community. And I see it all the time. You know, it sometimes softens the blow. It makes it more palatable. The intersection between Black women and the women's movement, or Black women and feminism, Black women and womanism, has always been something that's been a push-pull for me. I don't consider myself a feminist because that movement did not speak to many of my identities, and that movement in some ways was oppressive to me. White women, in fact, can in some ways be my main oppressor. And so I take your point that there's some conversation that needs to be had around this.
Can I say something here?
Yes.
That the MLK actually was, my other background is militarism. I was born on a military base. My brothers were Army, Navy, Marines. And MLK really was trying to say, hey, don't look at this, any country that's putting more money into defense than into social services is dying. Okay, so we're really not getting this, that our children are, all of them that are poor, are still being allured and being taught and trained to kill one another. And that means torture, blow them up, drone warfare. That is a big an expense and poisoning us in our water. So, you know, I just had to get, it's not okay. Okay, it's not okay to teach anybody to kill other people anymore at all. Thank you.
I appreciate that. I do. Oh my. We're hitting on some very sensitive topics here today, aren't we? So Lisa, I'd like to talk a little bit just about next steps, like how we move forward. I'd like to, of course, assume that Sandy and I and you will be able to connect and think about ways to move the conversation forward that we were beginning, and to address some of those well-meant moments that, to make them more productive and less destructive, to maybe eliminate some of the barriers to our communication, to cross-communication. And to find those moments of like creating sister circles, maybe that's what we do, create sister circles in times of, sister circles in times of strife, where there are some ground rules and we have to really kind of think about how we empower one another. I know that it's offensive to my white sisters when I say, you sometimes are my oppressor, more so than the men. And I know that that's a dissonance creating, not you, Lisa, but you as a gender and a race. And it becomes really challenging for them. And I understand that. And it's very difficult sometimes for me to say it. But it's true nonetheless. And as such, I think that in order for us to move forward, we have to find ways to address that and find ways to kind of coexist, support one another. We only need look, and I don't want to talk about politics because that's dangerous, but we only need look at the fact of our most recent president and who put him in the White House. And by and large, there's an article as well I could forward to everyone. I don't know which politics are, I don't really care. But the point is that there is a demographic that overwhelmingly voted for him, and it wasn't me. However, I can tell you that that demographic is going to suffer as a result of that vote. And sometimes I find that we vote against our own best interest. Don't know why we do that, but we do. As humans, we will vote against our own interest.
Propaganda.
And it's something that I think we need to also consider in that toolbox of things when we're trying to address some of the challenges. Everyone is really thinking about, who can I blame for my plight? Instead of working with your strengths and finding the humanity in these situations. So I know that we're running over, but I just wanted to kind of mention that there are some things that we can develop to find ways to move forward and to address some of these issues so that we're not continuing to have the same conversation, that we move forward just a bit.
So
another thing to just interject for us, I think that I would like to share is, and get out on the different networks that we all have, especially Compassion Cities, is Michael Moore's movie has been suppressed, the one Where to Invade Next. And those compassionate, loving, wonderful, restorative justice programs, women's, I mean, on and on, the cap and trade, the education, come on. We need to get those shown so that we can get the legislation to create these compassion cities shown everywhere. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I think to answer your question, next steps, I think there's a couple of things. We have scheduled for the 29th. We've been going back and forth at the 22nd or the 29th, and maybe we can move it to the 22nd, so it's next week. The next reaction to response call, as I said earlier in our conversation, is with two women, one a Black woman who was really her name is Alexis Morgan, and she wound up kind of by default taking the leadership role at this intersection of spirituality or compassion, spiritual coaching, and social justice. And she took, I'll say she has stepped into a role of leadership here because she was actually, in some of these conversations, the one who was regularly saying, wait, it's not so easy when we talk about law of attraction and manifestation. There's inherent in that kind of thinking, i.e. think your reality, work hard to create that reality, and that becomes your reality. She was saying, well, that's all fine and good, but within that image, there's a lot of packed social and racial prejudices that are inherent in that, because if you don't have doors open to you, it's a little harder to move things through. But anyway, so she and then another woman, Abigail Rose, have partnered, and they're doing this incredible educational program that's rooted in good academic literature as well as real world experiences about how do we shift this conversation, how do we raise women, how can white women open the door for our sisters of color. And I'm mentioning that because one of the things I particularly love about these women is I don't even know if they're considered millennials. I mean, they're, I believe, late 20s to mid 30s. And I feel like that giving them the space to take the lead in that conversation will help us also move forward, because, well, they're kind of the next generation, or they're parents of the next generation at this point.
Right.
And so I think that if maybe we can all engage in that conversation, and then from there, hopefully we can have a follow-up conversation about what to do, what kind of toolboxes can we create, and this is where maybe hopefully, to Sandy's point and your point, women and girls can really take a lead on this.
Yes. So unfortunately, I have a 1 o'clock I've got to get to.
So thank you for your time. And I look forward to seeing everybody on our next call, and thank you for this awesome conversation.
Lisa, thank you. Armenta, thank you. I look forward to carrying this on. You've opened something very important right here. Thank you to all of you who have spoken up, tried to speak up, and have listened deeply. So I really appreciate everybody here. On behalf of the Charter for Compassion International, we deeply appreciate you all.
So can I just say one more thing? If anyone, I don't know if this is what you do, if anyone wants to continue the conversation, Lisa, please pass my email on.
Sure.
Well, Facebook.
I guess the next question here is, do we want to follow up with this conversation? Schedule a time right here, right now, for the part 2 of this conversation.
Right. And perhaps what we can do is go offline and look at what maybe we can strategize and develop, and work also perhaps with the next 2 speakers too. And then develop maybe, maybe what we've just done is created a new project here. And I don't mean project, and I don't like that word, initiative.
And I think too, this is where we can also bring in some of the other Charter for Compassion
sectors. So
yeah. Social justice can be brought in here.
I think this would be really good. Yeah, let's continue the conversation, and other women's groups too, I think, because, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So thank you, everyone. And I hope if you're not, we'll continue part of this conversation on Facebook and on our Facebook page. And so if you have not already liked us on the Reaction to Response Facebook page, that was actually the intention of our Facebook page, was to have these conversations continue there. And so I would love it if we can go back there. And Armenta, I invite you to either send me or send Sandy a comment or something that you'd like to share, so that we can post it on your behalf as the lead conversation. Or I don't remember, you might have to be an administrator, but let's just continue this conversation there in the interim.
And you can just say, Bernadette, we did not get your chat if you sent your thoughts, so either you can send them there, or you can send them to, I'm going to drop my email in the box here for you. So I want to make sure before you hang up that we want to hear your thoughts.
All right. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, Lisa. Let's connect later on today.
Perfect.
Wonderful.
Be well,
bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Bye.